So here's what I'm going to leave it with. Okay, first of all, sometimes skeptics will say, I won't accept anything that's in the Bible. I'll only accept stuff outside the Bible, which is not logical because the Bible is still documented history. It's still history, whether you like it or not, okay?
No, the Bible is not history. It wasn't written by historians. It wasn't written by anybody we know. You know, it wasn't written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and all of that. Most of the authors of the Bible are entirely anonymous. Some things may have been written by Paul. I've heard criticism from some historians, biblical historians, that much of Paul's writings were forgeries, and possibly even all of them. And we know when you go back into the Old Testament, and we have just basically fantasy folklore and some mythic legends and that sort of thing. Tales that we know for certain never really happened. That's the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve, the Tower of Babel, the Exodus, and so on. So no, the Bible is not history. These are largely inspired by Homeric poems, perhaps. They were a lot of even the New Testament was written from Greek influences, Persian influences, Indian influences. There's elements of different religions mixed throughout, but there's very little actual fact.
But even for the skeptic who says, I won't trust anything in the Bible, I want to read to you very briefly a list of what we can learn from non-biblical sources from 2,000 years ago. These are not only non-biblical sources, it's from ancient Rome and from various Jewish groups and such that were against Christianity. So if you got every Bible on planet Earth and threw it away, and you took every manuscript and threw it away, and you took every writing from the early church fathers and threw them away, and the only sources you had were anti-Christian, hostile sources from 2,000 years ago in the first 2 centuries. What do we learn from just those writings? Let me give you a very quick overview of that if I could. I jotted them down here. Here's what we would learn. This is non-biblical stuff. Jesus existed. He was supposedly born of a virgin. He had an earthly father who was a carpenter. He was a teacher. He was a prophet. He taught repentance. He taught followers would become brothers and sisters. He changed the beliefs of the Jews. He claimed to be God. He claimed to be the Messiah. He had magical powers. He performed miracles. He healed paralyzed people. He accurately predicted the future. He was persecuted by the Jews. He was betrayed by a friend named Judas. He was beaten with rods. He was forced to drink vinegar. He was forced to wear a crown of thorns. He was crucified on the eve of the Passover. He was crucified under Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius. The sky grew dark during his crucifixion. There was an earthquake. He was buried in a tomb. The tomb was found to be empty. He reportedly appeared to people resurrected. He reportedly showed his disciples his wounds. His disciples say he ascended into heaven. One of his disciples was named Matthew. The disciples were persecuted and martyred for their faith. None of them recanted their beliefs. They switched from gathering on Saturdays to Sundays, the day of his purported resurrection. Jesus was worshiped as a god with hymns being sung to him, and after his crucifixion, something happened to cause Christianity to explode and the worshiping of Jesus to spread throughout the entire Roman Empire. Everything I just read to you comes not only from non-biblical sources, but hostile, anti-Christian sources from 2,000 years ago.
Dr. Dennis MacDonald, you are professor of New Testament and Christian origins at Claremont School of Theology in Los Angeles. So you are, I think, the ideal person to ask about this. Thank you for coming on, sir.
Pleasure to see you again. Thank you, Aaron.
Thank you so much. Yourself as well. I have questions. I mean, this guy, Bob Dutko, does not cite his sources, but I'm inclined to suspect that one of them is probably an interpolation that was of Josephus, something Josephus is known not to have actually written. And I suspect that some of his other sources may be the same. Who do you think he's getting this from? Because he doesn't say.
I want to start with the methodology. His issue is if one can somehow suck out of our memory all of the New Testament, we still have evidence of the stories in the Gospels, and he attributes those to historical record. Well, that is blatantly false. Jesus was not a popular character. It did not have a widespread fan base apart from those who early on, like the Pauline mission, believed in him. The other is that Jesus's opponents, and this is related to it, Jesus's opponents did not know anything about Jesus that they didn't know from the Christians who were using these texts. So you can't simply say you get rid of the New Testament and you have then no influence of the New Testament on the Christians, and their opponents knew what they were saying. So that is so obviously false. The opponents did not, and for the most part, didn't know the scriptures very well. They know what Christians were proclaiming, and they debunked what they heard was proclaimed. But it is a huge jump to go from that to the historical Jesus. Another problem is that the gospel authors and Paul don't agree about Jesus himself. So they themselves differ. So he doesn't make any distinction, let's say, between the Q document or oral traditions that inform the Gospels. Some of the issues he's dealing with are from the Gospel of John, some are from Paul, some are from Mark, and they don't agree with each other. So then by saying that you have these images that pagans recognize, or Jews that recognize of the Christian message, it cannot be used as independent historical record. And so in the list that you had shown me before, Aaron, there are some things that are in fact legitimate claims, but the majority of the claims are just bogus.
Let me ask about one specifically, the claim that Jesus was God. Because I have a problem with that, because I don't think you can get that Jesus claiming to be God. I don't think you can fairly glean that even from Scripture, much less from extra biblical sources, and certainly not from hostile to Christianity sources.
Well, one of the curious pieces is that in the mythologizing of Jesus, Jesus does play roles of deities. So like Hermes, he can walk on water. Okay? Like Aeolus, he can calm the winds and the sea. So the images of Homeric deities appear in the New Testament as a way of showing that Jesus is in no way inferior to those divinities. Now, those stories, though, are mythological. Jesus surely did not claim he himself was like Homer. I mean, like Hermes or Athena or Aeolus. That's just nonsense. And let's dial that back a little bit. There's no evidence that Jesus said he was the Christ. There's no evidence that he said he was the King of the Jews. The tradition, the earliest tradition we have is that he was a prophet and endowed with a sonship according to Q and to Paul. He was understood to be the Son of God, but that doesn't mean that he's biologically divine. It means that he's been designated as the primary spokesperson.
The way I understood that was that Jesus always only ever said that God was someone else, somewhere else, who could do things that Jesus couldn't do, and who, most more importantly, knew things that Jesus didn't know. So if Jesus was, say, God's character in this video game reality that we live in, then Jesus would still know everything that God knows, but that he's not an avatar. These can't be the same being. And when Jesus says that I and the Father are one, later in the same chapter, or the same book rather, Jesus asks God if his followers can be one with God in the same way that Jesus is one with God. So Jesus is asking somebody, not himself, for permission to do a thing. And obviously that means that Jesus is not one with God in the way that believers often assert.
Well, the Gospel of John does come close to saying that he is a God. In fact, it does say he's a God. But Jesus doesn't say that of himself. That's something that comes out of the Gospel of John. Now, one of the things that's already happening in our conversation with each other is we're kind of melding the New Testament together as a homogeneous piece of literature, which it certainly is not. And if I might, I'd like to plug a book that's going to be coming out very soon that's called Feuding Gospel Authors. Feuding Gospel Authors. How they don't like the other person's gospel, and how Matthew botches up Mark, and Mark is not happy about it. Includes Marcion's gospel, includes the Gospel of John. These authors don't like what the other person said. So it is
when
not.
you say these authors, you don't mean Mark or John or Luke, right? I mean, you're talking about whoever the anonymous author is that we later attributed these names to.
Anonymous or pseudonymous, that's right. So we just use these labels because they're convenient. We got to call them something, I guess. But it is amazing how different they are in their orientations. Now, what we have in this list by this Christian apologist is what I would call Christological stew, where you have various pieces put together that come from different theological and literary moments that are already mythologized quite clearly. You know, that Jesus rose from the dead would be an example, or was born of a virgin. Mark doesn't know that he's born of a virgin. Paul doesn't know that he's born of a virgin. You know, this idea of putting this stew together by the information that we can glean, and we can glean it from Christian opponents, Jews and pagans and so on. And then to have a profile of who Jesus is just laughable. I mean, it really is awful. And there's no serious scholar who he can tout who is going to go there. It is so undisciplined and clearly apologetic.
It was supposed to be, I think, that was Matthew made in the gospel erroneously attributed to Matthew makes a reference to that Jesus being born of a virgin is somehow in fulfillment of a prophecy from Isaiah, but the prophecy from Isaiah didn't have anything to do with Jesus. It was talking about another kid centuries before, who lived and died centuries before that. But it seems like whoever wrote Matthew didn't adequately read or understand Isaiah.
I think it's fascinating that the opponents of Christians never denied that Jesus existed. They never denied that he was a teacher. They minimized his role as an alternative Jewish thinker. So the most important issue for Jesus, apparently, was the dominance of Mosaic law in restricting the freedoms and rights of the poor and the marginal and those who are ill and so on. So that's why the earliest stratum has him arguing over the nomos, or the law of Moses, and getting in trouble with Pharisees, nomikoi. Paul carries that on, arguing that the love commandment is more important than obeying the commandments, and especially with circumcision. So we have to stratify the growth of the Christian tradition according to various trajectories. And these trajectories then are melded together by this Christian apologist in a way that no serious scholar would allow.
How many of you have heard of the name of Lionel LeCoux? Anybody know that name? Probably nobody. I know, Pastor Byers, I know you know. How many of you know the name Perry Mason? Does that ring a bell? Okay, now we're getting somewhere. Lionel LeCoux was like the real-life Perry Mason. In 1990, he went into the Guinness Book of World Records as the most successful trial attorney ever. He won his 245th consecutive murder acquittal. He never lost a case. Now, between us, I hope all those guys were innocent, okay? But this guy knows the law, and he knows what evidence will and will not stand up in a court of law. And so he decided to do a bunch of research of all the non-biblical evidence, non-biblical, to find out would the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus stand up in a court of law. You want to hear his final verdict? Here's what he said. I'll quote him. Quote, "I say unequivocally that the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ is so overwhelming it compels acceptance by belief that leaves absolutely no room for doubt." End quote.
What does this person, this person is not a biblical scholar, all right? He's
Evidently.
a lawyer, and he's a lawyer who's in defense of a cause. So he is not a scientific scholar trying to figure this out. I would like to know what he thinks the resurrection of Jesus was. Was it the resurrection of a body? Paul didn't think so. It was the flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God. What is the role of appearances? This is so problematic. And the other is, in the history of Greek literature, there are people who rise from the dead over and over and over again. The dying and rising God was a famous myth theme in antiquity. And early Christians are trying to make sense of the tragedy of Jesus' crucifixion. And they use a number of ways to forge that meaning. And one way is through resurrection. Another is the sacrificial death of Jesus, so that, you have the Passover notion. And you have other examples too. So this business about historicizing the resurrection really is a fool's errand.
What does that sound?
It's I'm sorry, I didn't mute my phone. That's all it is.
Okay.
But I can mute it now.
Well, we've only got a moment or so
Okay.
left.
All right.
So,
Yeah.
so my thought is, you're a biblical historian. You're a New Testament scholar. You were a Christian at one point in your life. I've listened to a number of your interviews. Of course, I talked to you before, once upon a time. And yet, for this claim is that this best ever trial attorney says that the belief in the resurrection, according to the evidence, is so absolutely overwhelming. Well, you know the evidence better than most, to be sure, and you don't appear to be absolutely overwhelmed.
You could say that. I just think it's a fool's errand. And what I would say to this attorney is the overwhelming evidence in science is that nobody rises from the dead. So that would be, if I were the attorney for the other side, I would say, how can you say that this is the one exception? Or if I'm in the world of ancient mythology, how is it that only in the sea of ancient mythology, how is it that only Jesus is not wet? He's the only fish not wet in the sea. So the evidence really just falls apart.
I've heard a similar claim about abstinence only being a perfect means of birth control, with that one exception. All right. Yeah, we can just. Do you need to take that?
No, I don't. No.
Okay. Can we stop it?
Yeah, it'll stop now.
Okay. Dr. MacDonald, wonderful to talk to you again. Thank you so much for helping out with this. I'd love to interview you for your next book. And if you're open to that, I'd love to do another project like this in the future.
I'll tell you why I would love that, not just to get the book out there, but also because I think, Aaron, this is an answer to the discussion we have today. The New Testament is not a homogeneous theological treatise. It comes out of different social identities with authors with different commitments, and they don't agree with each other. And one of the things that happens in theology, especially conservative theology, is that you have a homogenization of these differences. And so that you can't make cheese or butter out of homogenized milk. You have to keep it unhomogenized. And what this book, Feuding Gospel Authors, does is it unravels, it unbraids the New Testament so that you can see the various strands of development of understanding who Jesus was. All of them are in their own way noble. None of them is historical. But it's fascinating, I think, to uncover the differences in early Christian discourse as a way of handling the really the ignorance of so many Christian apologists.
I would be happy to read that book and then do an interview with it. I still got to squeeze in where I'm going to read Christianizing Homer, because that's still on my list too. But I'll get those done as soon as I can, and be happy to have you on again.
Okay, thanks for having me. Yeah.